Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be continuing our review and reading of The Delectable Negro by Benson Woodward, heavily edited by Justin A. Joyce. Now, remember, consumption has many forms. You can be consumed spiritually, emotionally, or even physically. We're on chapter 3, but part 4, called A Tale of Hunger Retold, Ref- Ravishment and Hunger in Frederick Douglass's Life and Writing. Frederick Douglass described slavery more eloquently than anyone else has as a cannibalistic institution. In images striking and poetically resonant, he depicted slavery in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, as a personified, stern reality, glaring frightfully upon us, its robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. Slave traders he thought of as human fleshmongers. In the context that Douglas described, slave owners cultivated consumption, hunger, and starvation at all levels of social interaction. If it was not Aunt Katie, the cook on one plantation, who was literally starving Douglas, then it was the master punishing a hungry slave for stealing molasses and making him drink gallons of it until he sickened and gorged on the sweetness. Such examples proliferate in all of Douglas's work, including Narrative, written in 1845, My Bondage and My Freedom, written in 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, written in 1881. To my knowledge, little scholarly analysis exists of the culture of consumption depicted in Douglas's narratives. This is striking considering that in Douglas's narratives and in the slave narratives I discussed in previous chapters, such references abound, not to mention those slaves who were literally consumed and the catalog of flesh cooking, consumption rituals, and habitual flesh taking that formed a part of the larger archive of consumption. Building on the findings of earlier chapters, I want to move beyond acknowledging and arguing for cannibalism as a social reality for the enslaved person to the particular ways that the male slave resisted and even internally wrestled with this dominant hunger and appetite. In this chapter, I examine three different ways that Douglas wrestled with consumption at the hands of others and self, the two acts often occurring simultaneously. First, I examine how mental and emotional consumption coincided with coded instances of rape at the hands of an overseer. Sexual and spiritual consumption overlap, especially in Douglas's first two narratives, providing insight into how he understood sex, at least abusive sex, as one way white men attempted to consume him. Also, in this first section, I introduce the topic of incest. The most formative sexual encounters that shaped Douglas's life and structure his narratives have to do with the incestuous treatment of an aunt, his mother, and himself. This topic of incest takes on increased importance as Douglas attempts throughout his life to work through sexually laden kinship ties with white men. The second thing I consider is a condition of mother hunger that characterized much of Douglas's life: the fear of social consumption, the hunger for family, for civilized lineage, for safety, physical satiation, and for paternity showed up often in Douglas's writing as mother hunger. Even in his relationships with white authoritative figures and heads of state, this mother hunger emerged as erotic desire, affection, and the need for care and intimacy. Lastly, I apply the framework of male effeminacy developed in the previous two chapters to Douglas himself. Alongside his heroic male identity, Douglas described himself as playing the role of a male concubine and a male daughter to the plantation system and to certain white male authority figures. Douglas depicts this role as mostly negative, but I focus on how, from a reproductive procreative perspective, this role strikes a balance in his life. For out of a dangerous, potentially self consumptive hunger, he gives birth to the central statutes and tenets of the U.S. Republic. This hunger and desire, combined with Douglas's intellect and stoic reserve, inform his vision and unique contributions of genius to American culture. Greetings, forecast, and Sister Raw and the elders listening with you. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks so much for tuning in and sharing in this time with me. For the most part, scholars of Douglas's written work have overlooked the proliferation of references to appetite, multiple layers of hunger, and consumption in his three narratives. David Van Leer, an exception to this trend, calls attention to a section from the narrative that highlights the horrors of cannibalism, dismemberment, and execution. In his cursory treatment of cannibalism in Douglas's narrative, Van Leer describes such occurrences as imaginative acts and part of a fictionalizing moment in Douglas's text. Importantly, rather than treating Douglas's claims as real, Van Leer metaphorizes and fictionalizes the race leader's observations. Van Leer analyzes textual and literary conventions such as the Gothic and sentimental traditions informing Douglas's style and choice of images. The deeper presumption underlying Van Leer's observations, and I believe fueling the inattention to this topic in Douglas's writing, is the notion that cannibalism has nothing to do with enlightenment, with myths of American progress, and with nation making in the 19th century. It is, to put it bluntly, inconceivable to most that cannibalism was an implicit aspect of slave culture and more broadly of American race caste systems based on the sycophancy of slavery. Still, Douglas depicts the slave institution as cannibalistic, and he gives us also a telling glimpse into the manner in which he internally resisted and wrestled with the reality of his social consumption. So, was he fighting integration in a way? Describing the slave condition as one of consumption and self consumption, Douglas describes slavery in the narrative as a condition of starvation, causing us to eat our own flesh. In the life and times of Frederick Douglass, he describes himself as enmeshed in webs of soul devouring thought that reinforce the fact that he is a slave. Douglas parallels the material reality of cannibalism with interlocking ideologies of cannibalism that allow the master to consume the slave in body as well as in spirit and thought. Douglas's observations affirm Carl O. Williamson's understanding of slavery as a highly stylized, institutionalized form of cannibalism. Williams describes thraldom or slavery as a degree of cannibalism wherein the master is a human parasite who, by right of might, has secured his fellow man in the bonds of thraldom in order to feed upon him for the satisfaction of his appetite. Further elaborating on the erotics of the libidinal hunger, Orlando Patterson notes that what the slave mainly fed was the master's sense of honor and his sexual appetite. For the economic role of the slave was quite marginal amongst most of the continental Germanic tribes. Germanic slavery, differing from U.S. chattel slavery, was less economically driven and more of a domestic variety, which served to highlight the interpersonal connections between master and slave. Though U.S. slavery was economically driven, this tie between the hunger and sexual appetite of the ruling class also applied to it. Perhaps even more so as the eroticization of the African type and early racial codes heightened white titillation at the thought of black flesh. In the 19th century, allusions to the consumption of and flesh hunger for black males proliferated in American culture. However, black men such as Douglas often alluded to this culture through subtle references to manhood and black male bodies exotically exposed before whites. In an 1854 speech delivered by the racial liberator before an audience of educated white males, Douglas debated the subject of black humanity. An ethnologist by the name of Mr. Grant, who was present at the meeting, distributed scientific statistics and studies as proof against the humanity of the Negro. A master elocutionist, Douglas used the stark example of himself, his powerful rhetorical capabilities, his face, and his entire physical conformation to refute Grant's argument. Turning to the assembled audience, he demanded of them, "You judge between me and that gentleman, Mr. Grant. Am I a man?" This exchange, and especially Douglas's closing reference to his manhood, calls to mind a more notorious contestation over gender that occurred the following year, in 1851. According to Dana Gage's synopsis of the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, Sojourner Truth had a commanding air about her, and consistently drew attention to the problem and plight of Black womanhood through her oft repeated question, "Aren't I a woman?" Which is actually, "Aren't I a woman's rights?" But we talked about that in the past. Cognizant of the biblical arguments against Black humanity, Truth references used references to biblical women to authorize her voice, and the fact that she could labor as much as any man to reset the premium of the burden and labor of Black females. On a separate occasion, at a meeting Truth convened in Indiana in 1858, the female inerrant preacher found herself challenged outright as a man and not a woman. Before removing herself backstage to undergo a breast exam by white women present at this event, Truth masterfully exposed the undercurrent of sexualization, incest, and the desire for access to Black female bodies that was fueling her accusers. She invited them to suck at her breast, offered to reveal her bosom before all persons assembled, and compared the men present to white babies sucking at the breast of a plantation nursemaid. Importantly, Truth's references to sucking, tasting, and ingesting allude to the social consumption of the Black female caregiver. Issues of sexual access, physical exposure, and rape also informed Douglas's presentation, but he deflected the audience's attention from the feminine exposure of his body by taking off his shirt to reveal his scars, by drawing their attention to the masculine display of his face, voice, and intellectual prowess. Navigating through undercurrents of exposure and concealment, secrecy and revelation, Douglas offers his visage and commanding posture as a standing accusation against the slaveholder fathers and their concealed sexual crimes. Douglas was well aware that whites, even abolitionist whites, took pleasure and gratification in seeing Black bodies exposed. In the text, My Bondage and My Freedom, he observes that John A. Collins, general agent of the Massachusetts Anti Slavery Society, would often introduce him as a graduate from the peculiar institution with my diploma written on my back. He found himself consistently referred to as a brand new fact, property, chattel, and a thing by abolitionists. Collins and others would habitually caution Douglas against speaking with too much education in his voice. Better have a little of the plantation manner of speech than not, they chided. 'Tis not best that you seem too learned or learned. The irony of having to speak in this manner from the so called slave body is that the most visceral truths pertaining to consumption and sexual maltreatment remained obscured. White men did not have to own up to their subtle phallic references and anxieties and their desire for a nurturing, consumable, Black male phallic object. I will come back to this connection among Black masculinity, nurturing, and white male appetite as it recurs in Douglas's relations with white men. The naked, unintelligible slave body served as fodder for the white imagination. It allowed whites to entertain the idea of the Negro as the lady of races, as passively subject to the more aggressive will and ways of the European. It also reinforced the idea of the slave as infantile. In relationship to abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, Douglas wrote that he stood something like that of a child to a parent. He hearkened back to Douglas's infantile relationships to cruel parental plantation masters. I place Douglas alongside Truth as a way of illuminating how they each had to negotiate the idea of Black humanity linked ideologically and historically to issues of gender and variance, sexual, homosexual abuse, white appetite, and incestuous kindred relationships to white masters and their plantation progeny. In contrast to Truth, Douglas and Black men are in general dealt with such issues through diversion. They drew attention away from their bodies and their sexuality. Am I a man? Aren't I a woman? Each question informed the other, and as questions rather than statements revealed a sense of gender instability both Douglas and Truth felt. We still do not know what to do with the reality of Truth's sexual molestation by one of her plantation mistresses, or more broadly, with the complex ways white women desired, hated, abused, and sexually lusted after Black women on the plantation. In the case of Douglas, who masterfully manipulated the desires and expectations of white men in his audience, questions of effeminacy, sexual abuse, and sexual transgression form a template. Not speaking about these topics, titillating and chastising his male listeners with this common knowledge make possible Douglas's claims to heroic masculinity. Scholars of Douglas's life and work have tended to focus upon and emphasize the male aspects of Douglas's genealogy, his relationships with Garrison and Wendell Phillips, his relationships to Auld, Covey, and Sandy from the plantation, his depictions of his maternal legacy as the Egyptian pharaoh of Ramses II. We should never forget that Douglas, a master linguist, always spoke in code. He always spoke to both sides of a gender fluidity that lay at the root of his epistemology and rhetorical self fashioning. Given this fact of Douglas's rhetoric, I want to move momentarily into the murky, unstable regions of the question, am I a man? Because I think that we have tended to presume too much about the fixity of Douglas's manhood. We have presumed too much, I feel, about Douglas's internal investment in being a man, especially when he consistently employed female modes of speaking about sexual violation, personal mythology, and genealogy in his writing. In addition to recording a masculine genealogy of experience, Douglas wrote to situate himself within the sublimated genealogy of female experience. As evidence of this female genealogy, I want to turn briefly to the notorious Aunt Hester scene, first recounted in Douglas's narrative and referenced in his last two autobiographies. Deborah McDowell has written that Douglas's graphic depiction of his aunt's abuse puts him into a voyeuristic relation to the violence against slave women, which he watches and thus enters into a symbolic complicity with the sexual crime he witnesses. Likewise, Van Leer has interpreted this scene as marking the impenetrable boundary of Douglas's manhood. He writes, as a man, he is shut out from a knowledge of this uniquely female experience. McDowell and Van Leer each in different ways presume a boundary of masculinity marked by female abuse. Van Leer suggesting even that Douglas was not sexually abused and was never subject to the struggles of sexual dominance that define his aunt's existence. While I do not want to dismiss valid points that do speak to Douglas's overt self-fashioning and performing of masculinity for his reader, I want to insert a third reality, and that is that Douglas narrates Hester's graphic abuse because he intimately understood it and because it was the only way that he could reference his own struggles over sex, against sexual consumption, and against the master's quest for sexual dominance over the male slave's body. The brutality and trauma of Douglas's narrative literally begins with the Hester scene. Up to that point, Douglas gives general information, a description of where he grew up, and details of his family life. A few pages into the narrative, the author assails us with the image of the aunt hanging from a meat hook in the kitchen. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for that purpose. He made her get up on the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length so that she stood up on the ends of her toes. Douglas alludes to the brutalizer's absence of pure morals and virtue. In his depictions of the master's cursing of Hester, frequently calling her a dumb bitch, and out of his outrage that she would go to see her lover from another plantation, Ned Roberts, Douglas gives us just enough information to understand the master's sexual motivations. While Douglas probably could have, he does not take from his memories a literal instance of rape. Slaves, both male and female, never depicted the graphic details of rape. They alluded to it often, but out of concern with decorum and preserving the sensibility of their readers, they never provided graphic sexual details. By giving us as a torture scenario laden with sexual tension and the implicit understanding that Anthony has raped Hester in the past, Douglas brings us more immediately into the layered and complicated meanings of slave life. In this world, physical brutality is often informed by sexual violence and the dynamics of sexual domination. Also important is the undercurrent of incest. Captain Anthony, the slave master, is Douglas's father, which Douglas knows at the time he pens the narrative. It is possible that Anthony's father raped Hester's mother, resulting in a kinship tie between the captain and Hester. Her noble form and graceful proportions unparalleled among the colored or white women of the neighborhood alluded to her mulatto racial status. Douglas does not give enough details for the reader to know her exact parentage. One thing that we know from slave history, though, is that incestuous behavior on many plantations was generational, a pattern of behavior that the son learned from the plantation father or overseer. Hester may have had a blood tie to Anthony. She may have been the daughter of his father, his uncle, or some other male relative. If Hester and Anthony did share a blood tie, then the prospect of Douglas cowering in the closet, fearing that he too might undergo the same type of punishment, takes on an added meaning. He is not just speaking of a child's terrors. Rather, he is honing in on the ways that this dynamic of sex and brutality unveils a dynamic of incest. Both literally and metaphorically, then, Hester embodies a female genealogy for Douglas, a genealogy characterized by the body so debilitated and abused that it cannot speak, by incestuous desire, by the ritual sport of abuse, by gender ambiguity, and most importantly, by the spectacle of white male appetite and hunger. It is no coincidence that Hester's beating takes place in the kitchen and that Anthony, like the master who beat Henry Bibb's wife, seems as though he would rather paddle a female than eat when he was hungry. Hester is hung up on a meat hook. Her pooled blood and flesh particles commingle with sites of food preparation, with the whole enterprise of feeding and sustaining life on the plantation. Hester brings into focus the multiple meanings of plantation torture and the difficulty of interpreting the scars and pain that result. As I showed earlier in the example with Douglas speaking about Black humanity before an all male audience, Douglas maintained a poignant awareness of the ways in which the naked, exposed body could work against him, diffusing his claims to representative manhood. The difficulty of speaking about the body, as I demonstrate earlier, shaped his early encounters with proprietary abolitionists. Early on in his public speaking career, Douglas refused abolitionists and the audience they generated access to his body. Touring throughout Europe with Garrison before the publication of his first narrative, Douglas replaced his body with that of his cousin Henny. Douglas frequently employed his cousin Henny to act out the role of the female victim as an ancillary to his anti slavery speeches, while also displaying ostentatiously a variety of whips, chains, and other tools of slavery, so as to make manifest the violence of a system that was often described elsewhere in more euphemistic terms. Douglas does exactly what McDowell asserts. He uses the mother and the female body as the vehicle that ensures his speakerly authority. In this way, the mother or woman's silence precipitates the male son's ability to speak. Henny shows, embodies, and demonstrates slavery, but it is Douglas who narrates and translates the body. He performs this same narration and translation on behalf of Hester. The effect of this gesture is that within the larger culture, Douglas comes to embody slavery, to take on the role of the pragmatic, paradigmatic slave, a gesture that was part of linguistic convention and a general cultural tendency to privilege maleness. So basically, he used his female cousin to represent all the horrors of slavery and enslavement. And in doing so, he maintained and preserved his own masculinity. Douglas was not the only Black male author from this time period to use Black female sex and torture in this manner. Francis Foster notes that from William Wells Brown's character of Clotel to Alex Haley's Kizzy, our most frequent images of slave women are as victims of illicit sexual intercourse and as childless mothers. According to Foster, the reason Black men gravitated to such depictions of Black women during slavery and after is that the selling of children and the raping of women were actual events, and the genre of slave narrative defined women in terms of manners, morals, and motherhood. Anticipating McDowell's observations, Foster sees Black men during slavery using female sex and abuse to foreground their manhood and natural paternal rights. Foster's observations show that Douglas's use of the Black female was not an individual occurrence. Rather, it was symptomatic of a culture of 19th century Black masculinity and slave narrative rhetoric. So it was no accident that he used the female slave in this way. This was consistent and deliberate. This was purposeful. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. McDowell writes of a latent grammar operating beneath Douglas's descriptions of the mother. McDowell refers mostly to Douglas's effacing of his maternal legacy and using Black maternal figures in his narratives to advance his claims to rugged individualism and self-made genius. So he didn't have anybody to teach him. He was this rugged individual, and this is a part of the myth making of the man, because somebody had to teach you how to read. Some community had to be there to reinforce the lessons that you learned. Someone got you to the eloquence of speech that you arrived at. But in his myth making, rugged individualism and self made genius were his claims to fame. Those were the things he wanted to put out there about himself to show that if he, as a man born a slave, could do it, others who were born enslaved could also do it, which is true, but it's also nonsense because nobody does it alone. And when you buy into the myth of rugged individualism, you are buying into a myth of individual exceptionalism. And no individual is exceptional without some type of community backing him up. But anyway, while this is true, there is also another implication of this latent grammar, and that is that Douglas consistently writes of Black female abuse and sexualization in order to locate the unspeakable dimensions of his own sex and embodied knowledge within this latent framework. As scholars, we have tended to read Douglas's narratives at the levels of rhetorical performance, convention, and sign. If rhetoric is the cumulative effect of oration, then grammar parses the finer units and the even finer components of these that enable this effect. A grammatical reading of Douglas's life and work begs that we draw closer, paying greater attention to mechanics, to details of body proximity, nuance, subterfuge, and male and female modes of speaking. Taking the idea of grammar literally, we should know that it is from women, such as Sophia Hugh, that Douglas gains the first rudimentary structure of the language. She teaches him the letters of the alphabet, to spell words of 3 or 4 letters, and to pronounce words from the Bible. It is her husband, Mr. Hugh, who breaks in on this opportunity for Douglas and forbids his wife to continue instruction. Ironically, from Master Hugh's lecture forbidding his reading, Douglas receives his first decidedly anti slavery lecture. Sophia's gesture toward teaching the rudiments of the language and her husband's negative response teach Douglas the first rules of the social grammar: inversion and subterfuge. He will apply these tools when he goes on to trick young boys into teaching him English by challenging their intellects, exchanging food for grammar lessons, and mimicking the letter system used to mark crates at the shipyard. Moreover, in the second narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglas reveals that his mother could read and attributes his love of reading and the creative means of acquiring literacy to her. I am happy to attribute, he says, any love of letters I possess, not to my admitted Anglo Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother. As with Hester, Captain Anthony sexually violated Douglas's mother, perhaps even subjected her to the same manner and style of abuse. The text of the page and the text of the female body are coterminous. For Douglas, learning to read and to speak the written word would always intersect with speaking from, around, and through sexual abuse and sexual consumption, lending an entirely different interpretation to McDowell's notion of a latent grammar, informing Douglas's engagement with the Black woman and mother. The male daughter. What do you guys think? Greetings, Anthony McPhail. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. What do you guys think? Do you think that Frederick Douglass had this complicated relationship with his white overseers and masters and bosses and the white abolitionists? And do you think that he was always seen as feminine, which is why he projected so much masculinity and strength and power, because he was internally dealing with the fact that he had seen his mother and his aunt raped, abused, and brutalized, and that he himself had been raped, abused, and brutalized, and that he was always challenging that internal demon. Anyway, the male daughter. Scholars have had a challenging time deciphering Douglas's public letter written to his former slave master Thomas Old in 1848. William S. McFeely, the Douglas biographer, refers to the letter as one of the strangest pieces in the literature of American slavery. What makes this letter so strange is the fact that Douglas speaks vicariously through the voice and body of a young white daughter. Added to this, he alludes to a relationship, a very intimate, erotic relationship between himself and his former master in this female voice. One gets the sense of Douglas and his former master as estranged natural enemies on one hand, and on the other as intimate sharers of a deep binding secret. When one thinks about this letter, written by Douglas as a coded way of speaking about his own rape, his own body through female metaphor, it does not appear strange at all. Instead, it serves as an example of how Douglas's overt grammatical gestures were oftentimes informed by latent inverted references to his own sexual and sexualized to his own sex and sexualized treatment. The occasion for writing the letter is the anniversary of Douglas's emancipation. Celebrating himself in his own venue, the North Star paper, Douglas gives his own synopsis of his liberation and what it means to him, 3 years removed from a life of bondage. Addressing Auld in 1848, he writes, Sir, the long and intimate, though by no means friendly, relation which unhappily subsisted between you and myself leads me to hope that you will easily account for the great liberty which I now take in addressing you in this open and public manner. I have selected this day on which to address you because it is the anniversary of my emancipation. How, let me ask, would you look upon me if I were some dark night in company with a band of hardened villains to enter the precincts of your elegant dwelling and seize the person of your own lovely daughter Amanda and carry her off from your family, friends, and all the loved ones of her youth? Make her my slave, compel her to work and take her wages. More and still horrible, leave her unprotected, a degraded victim to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers who would pollute, blight, and blast her fair soul. Rob her of all dignity, destroy her virtue, and annihilate in her person all the graces that adorn the character of virtuous womanhood. I ask, how would you regard me if such were my conduct? Mm, that's deep. That's deep. What has struck many as immediately strange is Douglas's slipping between speaking I and speakerly her, and a speakerly her. Essentially, his easy transition between his black male body and voice and the body and voice of a young white plantation mistress. In particular, for McFeely, most strange is the fantasy of the rape of Amanda, the daughter of Thomas and Lucretia, from Douglas's remembered, whom Douglas remembered both as a child Aud cherished and as one who had been a kind of young friend. Others, reading against the grain of the letter, have hinted that Amanda is a metaphor for Douglas's own ravishing at the hands of white men. I agree with this perspective and feel that Douglas attempts to convey through this letter are the powerful ways in which he and Auld share a union in body and soul. The fact that they share a terrible calamity that has made them both kin. Mm. Were Douglas, hypothetically speaking, Ald's daughter, such acts committed against him by Ald and other men of his class would qualify as acts of incest. Keeping the letter to Ald in mind and returning to the narrative, we find a direct correlation between the sacrifice of the daughter to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers and the rape of Douglas at the hands of the slave breaker Covey. A short time after being sent to Covey, Douglas is given the responsibility of herding the oxen. While standing at the gate to Covey's plantation, The oxen grow excited and rush through the gate, tearing their cart to pieces and almost crushing Douglas against the gate. A livid covey discovers his demolished property, and in his anger, he orders Douglas to strip down nude in preparation for a beating. Douglas writes, "He ordered me to take off my clothes. I made him no answer. He repeated this order. I still made him no answer, nor did I move to strip myself. Upon this, he rushed at me with the fierceness of a tiger, tore off my clothes, and lashed me till he had worn out his switches, cutting me so savagely as to leave marks visible for a long time after." Douglas makes much of the pleasure and excitement that Covey receives from such seasoning rituals. The suggestive nudity, the tearing into the flesh, the physical climaxing, and the wearing out of lash and clothing all suggest a type of sexual violation. In the text, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglas references to ravishment reoccur. In another instance, among many, Covey tears into Douglas even more viciously, causing Douglas to proclaim, "Had I escaped from a den of tigers, I could not have looked worse." After this beating, Douglas escapes from Covey with the intention of going to Auld, showing him the horrific proof of his condition and seeking intercession. I had begun to hope that my master would now show himself to be a nobler light than I had seen before, but I was disappointed. I had jumped from a sinking ship into the sea. I had fled from the tiger to something worse. In this passage, we have a direct correlation between the master who prostitutes his daughter to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers and Auld himself. Whereas Covey is true to his nature, bloodthirsty and predatory by virtue of his vocation and temperament, Auld is an altogether different animal. The letter makes clear that what makes Auld even more reprehensible, more immoral than Covey, is the fact that there is a blood tie, a clandestine, a clandestine relationship that binds him to Douglas. Covey's crime is rape, but Auld's crime is incest. He takes the ultimate pleasure and gain from Douglas's violation, the breaking of his slave, reinforcing his genteel Southern standing, his authority and influence among plantation owning peers. Covey makes delight and sport of Douglas. He tortures him at least once a week for 6 months. The reader, who has to but repeat in his own mind once a week the scene in the woods where Covey subjected me to his merciless lash, to have a true idea of my bitter experience there during the first period of the breaking process through which Mr. Covey carried me. Following this passage, and in numerous places throughout Douglas's narrative, he insinuates that much worse than what he can describe occurred on Covey's plantation. I have no heart, he admits, to repeat each separate transaction. Such a narration would fill a volume much larger than the one present. I aim only to give the reader a truthful impression of my slave life without unnecessarily affecting him with harrowing details. Up to this point, I have suggested that sexual violation is metaphorically present in Douglas's narrative, But I think it is important to consider that Douglas may have in fact been literally raped. For what could be more harrowing in description than the blood soaked scenes that he describes? What details missing from all three volumes of his autobiographies could fill additional volumes? A genre of short story and novels about slaves that became popular at the end of the 18th century is implicitly referenced in Douglas's narrative. In this tradition of writing, Europeans and white Americans geographically depicted the rape of enslaved males through language and metaphors similar to those used in Douglas's narrative. Joseph Lavallee's Le Negre comme il y a peu de blancs, the Negro as there were few white men, is a perfect example of this tradition. Lavallee, a French Montesquieu, published Le Negre in 1790. That same year, other authors translated the text to English and serialized it in magazines in England and the United States. The protagonist of Lavallee's novel, Itinoko, is an African man captured by French slavers off the coast of West Africa and taken into slavery. Lavallee's text was a highly sexualized treatment of the African and European colonial relation. Ship hands consistently remarked upon how Itinoko's physicality and imagined themselves bedding the African. His nakedness and the size of his genitalia are noted. Itinoko engages in a romantic friendship with the ship captain's son. The ship captain intends to sell Itinoko into a position of sexual service. But before selling him, the captain cannot restrain the desire to sample the slave himself. Itinoko describes Urban, the white slaver, as a ravisher, a perfidious ravisher who was struck by the comeliness. Urban feels compelled to violate what is most sacred among men. Itinoko describes his rape in animal like metaphors, saying, I bore resemblance to a man who, weary with struggling with a tiger that threatened his life, would fall into a voluptuous sleep between the clutches of the monster. John Salient describes Itinoko as a prototype for the Black man who appeared between 1790 and 1820 in anti slavery narratives, essays, and poems. Deserving benevolence, but denied it by his white masters, this sentimentalized poor Negro, he clarifies, on American soul, became an eroticized friend, echoing the homoeroticism of classic martial virtue, as well as gesturing toward 19th century blackface and its interracial homoerotics. Douglas, as disenfranchised friend and one abolitionist ally with, definitely writes as a sentimentalized poor Negro. Furthermore, Itinoko's allusions to struggling with a tiger cast light on the sexual implications of similar details in Douglas's narrative. Even if Douglas did not did not read Lavallee's story, though it is possible that he did, either in American serialized form or during his time spent in England with Garrison, abolitionists read the story in serialized form in U.S. magazines. Douglass wrote to a community of readers on both sides of the Atlantic that would have implicitly understood his allusions to that most unspeakable outrage, male rape. Furthermore, it was common within the United States sentimental tradition to refer to rape through animal metaphors such as tigers and wolves. In the book Red Rock, written by Thomas Nelson Page, he describes the rape of a white woman by a black man as a single tiger spring, as black claws sinking into a soft white throat. Abolitionists and the larger educated American readership would have immediately recognized Douglass's numerous references to rape and been able to read between the lines of the narrative to ascertain that Douglass had probably been raped by Covey or other males on the plantation in the plantation community. Mhm, mhm, mhm. Hazel Carby makes a useful point regarding how we think about rape both on and off the plantation and at different moments in American history. Rape, he says, Hazel says, should not be regarded as a transhistorical mechanism of women's oppression, but as one that acquires specific political or economic meanings at different moments in history. Hazel Carby refers here to the need to distinguish the political import of Black women raped on plantations from Black women raped during the Reconstruction era in the South as a means of economic and social control. Her statement, though, applies to the subject of male rape. We have tended to regard rape as happening only to biological females. In Black uplift discourse, the phallus and castration of the phallus are always emphasized. Yet, what does it mean that Douglass, reticently in his first narrative, and more directly in his second and third narratives, and in his letter to Auld, calls our attention to the subject of male rape? I find that what we get in part through Douglass's depictions of rape is his understanding of rape as definitionally linked to a culture of consumption. From Hester being tempered and flesh tended in the Anthony kitchen to perpetrators depicted as tigers and wolves, Douglass emphasizes how rape and sexual violence are a means of satiating a cultivated white appetite for black flesh. Southern slavery apologist George Fitzhugh explained the political economy of slave consumption in the following manner. The use of an article is only a proper subject of charge when the article is consumed in the use. For this consumption is the consumption of the labor for the lender or hirer, and is the exchange of equal amounts of labor for each other. Thought of as an object of labor, as labor itself in the mind of many slave owners, the slave could be completely consumed with no moral repercussions. Rape, in this context, serves as an index for a larger culture of consumption, the sex act being a means to take self from the slave and ritualistically consume this taken self. So it was all about control over the slave so that they had no personhood left. They had no body autonomy left. There was no remnant of I own myself left inside of the slave because I can take your body, I can force you to work, I take your money, I can take your children, your spouse, your house. I can take you from one spouse tonight and tell you to go breed with another spouse tomorrow, or I could take you sexually from either of them and rape you myself and make you get pregnant. You had no right, none. The subtext of sex and consumption lends an entirely different meaning to constant references to female rape in Black male writings. Surely it tells us something about the nature and confines of Black masculinity in the 19th century, specifically about the impossibility of translating Black male sexual abuse into usable political currency. The raped Black female and emasculated Black male dyad aside, Black men among themselves held each other to a strict code of masculinity that entailed never being sexual objects and defining their masculine relationship to one another through Black female violation. Writing to the tribe of Black husbands and fathers in Walker's Appeal to the colored citizens of the world, David Walker implored, "Oh, my colored brethren all over the world, when shall we rise from this death like apathy and be men?" Walker implicitly defined Black manhood as the ability to protect wives and mothers from rape and other forms of abuse. For men like Douglass and Walker, the subjects of female rape and the larger institution of slavery linked implicitly to the issue of social consumption. Walker never lived as a slave. He was born to a free mother and an enslaved father in Wilmington, North Carolina. Yet he understood slavery as fundamentally a system of appetite and consumption. In Walker's Appeal, he writes, "They keep us miserable now and call us their property, but some of them will have enough of us by and by. Their stomachs shall run over with us. They want us for their slaves and shall have us to their fill." For Walker, social consumption is equal to social death, a death like apathy, the outcome of Black persons continually fed into the glut of slavery is that they will cease to exist, literally, psychologically, and spiritually. Already in their death like apathy, Walker finds that Black men have faded from their lives and from natural agency. Walker invokes the female body as womb and vessel of racial continuity, subtly connecting this aspect of Black female anatomy to social consumption, vis a vis, and by saying, "We cannot help the whites murdering our mothers and wives," he says. He ties racial continuity to the female anatomy. Black male rape, the particulars of Black male consumption, and Black male reproductive capacity do not figure into the Walker cosmos. In this worldview, the Black woman symbolizes body and sex, and the Black male embodies the opposite values: reason, action, and virility. The Black male does not have a reproductive capacity, and he also has no strongly defined interiority. I think they were trying to say inferiority, but there's a T there. I don't know. But I'm going to say he has no strongly defined inferiority. Douglass writes within a similarly closed circuit, alluding to himself as erotically consumed, but finally positioning himself outside of this dynamic through his notorious battle with Covey, his acquired literacy, and his eventual escape from slavery. The letter written to Auld and Douglas's descriptions of ravishment at the hands of Covey, though disrupt his genealogy and urge us to rethink this idea of the feminine as external to Black male experience. Might the illusions of himself as daughter and as a sexually vulnerable entity be indicators of a regenerative capacity, an ability to regenerate self that eluded eluded the larger culture of sexual and psychic consumption? Along this same line, might Douglas have revealed at the same time that he concealed how his masculinity and master related to him and saw him as a daughter or as a feminized sexual conquest? Whites were fond of referring to him as the only perfectly pronounced and complete specimen in the world of his color, kin, and kind. As a youth, the race leader carried a newspaper clipping around that described him in romantic terms as a uniquely American creature, a natural outcome of the fated American experience and experiment. Mount Caucasus and the mountains of the moon were joined with our Indian wilderness to mix the strain of blood from three races in his veins and produce a peculiar individuality with no antecedent or copy of his traits, evoking at once savagery, the feminine allure of the natural world, and the danger of colonization, of occupying a foreign country. This article served as a reminder that Douglas's masculinity was an open-ended question that could be just as easily deployed by the state and the abolitionist cause. This discussion picks up many of the themes of male rape that I earlier elucidated. The ways in which and reasons that Black male rape has remained a categorical impossibility and therefore impossible to speak about. On political and rhetorical levels, the subject of Black male rape has always implied much more than the sex act or sexual preference. Douglas's letter and in his personal narrative, his abuse under Covey convey the subject of male rape as layered through the issues of a Black-white kinship, gender variance, and ambiguity, and the conundrum of same-sex reproduction. Naturally, when we have thought about the rape of Black women during slavery, we have thought about it in terms of progeny or reproductive capacity. Our limited concepts of Black male biology and interiority have inhibited our thinking in the terms of Black male emotional and erotic life. More specifically, Black men have the ability to generate life. A part of what I am urging and will reinforce in the next section of this chapter is that we expand our notions of Black experience and cultural formation to include Black men as agents of reproduction, sexual subjectivity, and effeminate values, among other categories of experience. So he wants us to see the Black man as a reproductive engine and entity in and of himself. He wants us to see the Black man as possessing a womb and the power of co creation, when biologically that's not a true statement. And we have to take a step back and figure out what he's talking about. Now, I'm going to go back to a comment that the forecast made. A lot of the practices, a lot of them practiced Greek culture and violated many young boys that they enslaved. And by then, they had been abused so long, they didn't know any different. So you have to recognize that these enslavers were practicing a culture that was passed down to them where they prefer the male booty to the woman's vagina, where they prefer a young male, and especially a young male that was as exotic as a Frederick Douglass, because he was black, he was white, he was Native American. So he had all of this different blood coursing through his veins, right? And he was a fetish to them. And the author here, the editor, I believe here, is taking that fetishization, and he himself, being a white male, is expressing the white male craving that they had for these particular males, these particular African males, for the black body. So this is the editor taking some literary license here to say that Douglass had these complicated feelings within himself. Douglass knew he was a man and he knew his manhood had been violated. I believe that to be true. But I don't believe that Douglass had these complicated feelings towards men. He knew it was wrong, and he was trying to express it as best he could at that time. Mapping mother hunger. In the final phase of this chapter, I want to dwell more fully on the idea of the Black male interior. The themes of emotional, psychic, and spiritual hunger have historically constituted female domains of experience. Within 19th century rhetoric, men do not speak, at least overtly, in terms of hungering, needing to be filled emotionally or otherwise. It is like an undiscovered, mysterious land, this region of Black male interiority that we suspect exists, but that we have little concrete evidence of, few artifacts to which to verify its existence. In Douglass's writings, Mother Loss and Mother Hunger, the desire for the mother, the desire for an intimate familial touch, to know one's origins and tribal legacy, serve as emotional guideposts that help us to understand where and how Douglass hungered, and from where within himself he transformed this potentially self consuming hunger. In my final analysis, I read this mother hunger, beyond the physical loss of his mother, as a fecund place within Douglass's self, from which he gives birth to the promise of the Republic, himself as a masculine icon, and all of the emotional and psychic hungers that he carries out of slavery. Although he sees very little of her, Douglass's mother leaves an imprint on his emotions and memory that will later permeate and shape his masculine identity and internal landscape. In the narrative, he recalls that in spite of the risk of death and the threat of potential beatings, his mother frequently traveled miles to visit him at night. He writes, "She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get." As an infant, Douglass cannot be aware of the hardships and fatigue that his mother goes through to be with him. The 4 or 5 times that he sees her, he feels only her warm comfort. They communicated very little during these nightly rituals. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I awake, she was gone. And long before Douglas could awaken as an adult man to the great pains and obstacles his mother overcame to see him, she dies. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. When she died, no, she died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. Adding to the pain of this loss is the fact that Douglas was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. A pattern of loss and unrequited need is set in Douglas. Plantation culture and masters cultivated this emotional and natal hunger. Such hunger, arguably more than physical acts of torture, conditioned slave psyches and bodies for larger acts of social and literal consumption. In the narrative, Douglas describes how he, his sister Eliza, and his aunt Priscilla were kept in a state of perpetual hunger and starvation. A great many times have we poor creatures been nearly perishing with hunger. When food in abundance lay moldering in the safe and smokehouse, and our pious mistress was aware of the fact, and yet that mistress and her husband would kneel every morning and pray that God would bless them in basket and in store. In addition to starving Henny, Ald would frequently tie her up and whip her as a precourse to taking his meals. I have known him to tie her up early in the morning and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to his store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in places already made raw by his cruel lash, recalls Douglas. What makes Henny so delectable to the master is the fact of her being almost helpless. Henny has no parents to protect her and look out for her. Burned during a childhood accident, she has little use of her hands. Her state of deprivation slakes Ald's appetite and causes him to choose her above all others as the subject of his morning and evening meal taking rituals. Later in life, Douglas would experience no less cruel form of starvation conditioning at the behests of Miss Lucretia Auld, the female head of the plantation. Often Mrs. Auld forced Douglas to sing for his food beneath her bedroom window. When pretty severely pinched by hunger, I had a habit of singing, which the good lady very soon came to understand as a petition for a piece of bread. When I when I sung under Miss Lucretia's window, I said I was very apt to get well paid for my music. Making Douglas perform in the age-old role of romantic singer, Mrs. Auld seemed to imagine him courting her or titillating her with his hungering pleas. She no doubt took pleasure in such remonstrations, which she encouraged and rewarded with food. Many on the plantation implicitly understood this culture of hunger and deprivation as it was acted out in daily relations. Aunt Katy, the cook on the Anthony plantation, would frequently punish Douglas for a slight or an offense by making him go all day without food. Douglas would often fight the dog for scraps of food and bake stolen pieces of dried corn in the fire. Such acts of starvation wounded Douglas most deeply in his heart and soul. He writes of trying to keep his spirits up, but eventually going out behind the kitchen wall to cry. Surprising Aunt Katy one day, Douglas's mother visits and witnesses her starving him. His mother has words with Katy. That night, he says, I learned what I had never learned before, that I was not only a child, but somebody's child. I was grander upon my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. For Douglas, the worst starvation involved being emotionally cut off from and made to hunger for his mother's love and care. His mother literally and spiritually saves him from self consumption or starvation by affirming and feeding his sense of self. For that was the danger and underlying intention of the culture of consumption, to imprint slaves so deeply with hunger that they came to relate to themselves as essentially commodities, and to also consume themselves with a litany of soul devouring thought and behaviors reinforced by the master's hungers and tastes. Despite the oppressive intentions of masters who facilitated this culture of hunger, enslaved persons often found the will to invert this structure using their own hunger as a means of resistance and survival. The graphic example of Lavinia Bell conveys a sense of hunger as to the will to survive. As punishment for running away from the plantation, Belle's master leaves her to hang in a tree by wire threads that cut into her flesh. She suffers starvation and the devouring presence of birds and other animals of prey. After days being left in this condition, Belle makes a strategic choice. She attempts to tear out her eyes and eat them. Douglas experienced such survivalist aspects of hunger as tied to the memory and loss of his mother. Mother hunger informed his relationship with white male authority figures and heads of state. In the context of this hunger, white men took on maternal significance and roles in Douglas's life. This deep yearning for the feminine, in some instances, brought the same out of Douglas, who depicted himself and the heroic male figure as giving birth to the values and central tenets of the Republic. Operating out of an essentially feminine praxis of survival, Douglas turns a potentially devouring legacy of slavery and emotional state of loss and longing into a self that is gender ambiguous and imbued with a regenerative capacity. One of the last places one might expect to find residues of Douglas's mother loss and child need would be in his adult relationships to white men. From the mythic battle with Covey on, Douglas would have us believe that he approaches and quickly passes beyond the temporal and psychic territory of slavery. But even at the end of the narrative, as Douglas intently pores over issues of the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and prepares himself to enter fully into the abolitionist speaking circuit, he admits, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to a white to white people weighed me down. 9 years later, white abolitionists would oppose Douglas's wish to start his own newspaper, referring to him as a slave, assuming to instruct the highly civilized people of the North. These contemporary eruptions of slavery differed from the personal sacred ways that Douglass carried slavery in his heart and mind. In a letter written to Harriet Tubman in 1868, Douglass refers to her and John Brown as consigned to his sacred memory of slavery. The sacred memory of slavery arose from a tender place in Douglas's and Douglass connected it to his mother. Remarking on the death of his mother and the fact that he was denied permission to attend her funeral in my bondage and in my freedom, he stated that scenes of sacred tenderness around the deathbed never forgotten, and which often arrest the vicious and confirm the virtuous during life, must be looked for among the free, though they sometimes occur among the slaves. It has been a lifelong standing grief to me that I knew so little of my mother and that I was so early separated from her. This sacred maternal memory is connected to feelings of safety, the relieving of the slave child's suffering, and for a longed for home space. When he felt in this way toward white male allies such as Garrison, John Brown, and President Abraham Lincoln, Douglass usually also romanticized these men, describing them as perfect examples of beauty. Douglass reenacts this need for a home and safety in the life and times of Frederick Douglass, approximately 10 years after Douglass has bested the brutal Covey. The race leader reaches yet another milestone in his quest for a masculine identity. President Abraham Lincoln invites him to a party at the executive mansion in honor of his reelection. Douglass feels overwhelmed with the presence of the elite there and enthralled by the power of this historic moment. He writes, I had for some time looked upon myself as a man, but now, in this multitude of the elite of the land, I felt myself a man among men. So he felt his most actualized as a man when he could be in the room with powerful men, which is crazy because he was making them the standard. But you have to remember that this was 1865 and that he had a slave mind, similar to some of the things and the excuses and allowances we have to make for Booker T. Washington, who was also born into slavery. So to recognize that he himself was a man among men when he was in a room full of the elite of the country, which is a room full of white men, then we have to make an excuse for him to recognize that he had the mind of a slave. Although under much different circumstances, there is another instance from Douglass's life when the presence of white men, of white male power and civilization, bring on an epiphany in the race leader. This newly discovered sense of manhood is only magnified by the presence of the white female friend, Miss Dorsey, who has agreed to accompany him on his journey. Hand in arm, the black Douglass and the white Miss Dorsey approach the entrance to the White House. At the entrance, Douglass's momentary reverie quickly shatters. The policemen stationed at the door to the president's mansion inform him that they are to admit no persons of his color, and just as abruptly take him by his arm and order him to stand back. Suddenly, Douglas is outside, no longer a man among men. The officers, as policing extensions of the state, remind him of his nigger status. No wonder the black men he invited refused his invitation. Used to such treatment from whites in low and high places, they did not look forward to such discomfiture as they described it. But undaunted by the officer's racism, Douglas and his ally refused to leave. A passerby recognizes Douglas and rushes within to inform President Lincoln of his guest's detainment at the door. Lincoln immediately sends word to allow Douglas entrance to the mansion. Douglas and his companion are escorted to the spacious east room of the president's mansion. Douglas is taken aback by the luxuriousness of the scene and bounty and plenty reflected in the architecture, the drink, the suited and gowned personages, the food and the fraternity. He recalls a scene of such elegance, such as in this country I had never witnessed before. Lincoln restores Douglas's masculinity, and Douglas in turn responds with a description of Lincoln as rising like a mountain pine high above all the others, gathered in the East Room. Seeing Lincoln stirs deep feelings in Douglas. Lincoln counters his feelings of outsiderhood, of isolation, with his grand simplicity and home like beauty. Lincoln's eyes and mouth moved Douglas to poetic description. His eyes had in them the tenderness of motherhood, and his mouth and other features the highest perfection of a genuine manhood. Douglas's childhood dreams and maternal hunger are mapped onto the larger American dream and the White House as home. Longing after and eulogizing Lincoln's maternal bosom, Douglas asks, "What are sweet of peace? What are visions of the future?" Like his very own laboring mother, Douglas finds Lincoln's face a blending of suffering with patience and fortitude. Douglas even romanticizes the president's lips, imagining them as perfect, aesthetically pleasing, and the most genuine specimens of manhood. A part of what made Lincoln so attractive to Douglas was the president's apparent commitment to freeing enslaved persons. But we know the truth about Lincoln and his desire to free enslaved persons. He said he didn't care about slavery one way or the other. He just wanted to preserve the Union. Both Tubman and Brown of sacred memory sacrificed their lives for enslaved persons. It is of something of the slave in Douglas, the one who has had to constantly battle for freedom and a place to rest, who sees finally in Lincoln the maternal bosom, an emblem of a final resting place. He relates to Lincoln as a romanticizing male child, a male to female romantic object. Lincoln is in turn depicted as male patriarch, as maternal figure, as fecund female earth. The undercurrent of mother hunger blurs gender boundaries and causes Douglas to transfer Lincoln a measure of unrequited love and feelings of mother loss. Descriptions of Miss Lucretia Auld years earlier on the Auld plantation prefigure his descriptions of Lincoln. Mrs. Auld, he writes, has bestowed upon me such words and looks as taught me that she pitied me if she did not love me. In a related instance aboard a steamer, Douglas encountered Edward Marshall, a California congressman. He describes Marshall in terms that are both deific and evoke the natural world. The catalyst for Douglas when describing Marshall in this manner is a racist incident aboard the steamer. The captain orders Douglas to be physically removed from the dining room. Marshall rebuffs the steward with eyes full of fire. Douglas sees lightning flash and imagines this saving individual as a deity of the sky with golden hair and fiery eyes, whose voice resounded like a clap of thunder. In this instance, Douglas casts himself in the more effeminate role, describing Marshall as chivalrous, gallant, and possessed of generous and manly qualities. Not coincidentally, Marshall had just come from Kentucky, where he had visited his black mammy. I was nursed at the breasts of a colored mother, he admits. Both Lincoln and Marshall intervene on behalf of the freed slave. Their allegiance to the abolitionism evokes in Douglas romantic feelings that range from the maternal caste, to a glorification of the white male as the emblem of the natural world and the natural order of things. Marshall does not take on the sacred significance and emotional complement of the Black mother. Instead, Black mother as emblem of infantile hunger, the white man nursing at the Black woman's breast, is cause for shared affection between the two men. Douglas was in a phase of his life when he believed that proximity to Black nobility and empathy could change whites. I want to take a moment to unpack some of that. He believed that if Black people and white people, he believed that integration, right, would open the eyes of white people and change their mind, and specifically to Black nobility. So he believed that if the best of Black people, right, which may or may not have been the mass, which were not the mass of Black people, but if the best of Black people, if the nobility among the Black people could gain access to white folks, then white folks would change their mind. And at some point, we have to stop believing that proximity or closeness to whiteness or exposure to whiteness, even if they are exposed to the very best of us, will make them see all of us or any of us as different, because they won't. We will still just be a nigga. We will be their pet nigga, but we will still just be a nigga to them. So we have to dismantle and dislodge that thought that any level of proximity to whiteness is going to make white people accept Black people more. Okay? He would realize, though, after finding out about Lincoln's support of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, that Northern whites had used him and the enslaved person's cause to further their nationalist and other political aims. At the undraping of a bust carved in Lincoln's honor years later, Douglas would describe Lincoln not as a caring, valiant, romantic object, but as one who had betrayed his love and affections. Speaking before hundreds of white persons at this honorary occasion, Douglas regrettably reminds those gathered of Lincoln's hypocrisy and willingness to sacrifice Black people. Douglas came to that conclusion, and he says, He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master and to suppress a slave rising for liberty. Though his guilty master were already in arms against government. So what he's saying is that Lincoln, by signing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and agreeing with it prior to his presidency, that he had wanted to send enslaved people back to slavery, even as the Confederates were rising up in arms to to stand against the United States government. So even as the Confederates were standing there willing to fight against the United States government, Lincoln was still on their side. Lincoln's willingness to send a fugitive slave back to his master was most painful for Douglass, who himself was an escaped slave. In this public address, Douglass speaks about how he, as representative of the slave experience, felt betrayed by one he was so willing to love, admire, and seek solace in. Speaking to his white fellow citizens, Douglass admonishes, first, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. To you, it especially belongs to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues. Douglass speaks of white people as children, Lincoln's true children, and Black people as stepchildren. This statement harkens back to the problematic issue of kinship between Black and white men during slavery. Douglass is a free man, a man of agency and influence, but still the historical problem of relatedness and all of its emotional and sexual implications bear down upon him in the present. It is during slavery that the orator first develops the habit of romanticizing and identifying himself with the white male aristocracy. When he leaves the Covey plantation, he contrasts Covey's membership in the demeaned overseer class to that of a Mr. Freeland. Freeland acts toward him with a sentiment of honor, a sense of justice, and a feeling of humanity. Mr. Freeland belongs to that class of slaveholder admired and affectionately thought of by the slaves. Slaves were not, Douglass notes, insensible to the whole souled qualities of a generous, dashing slaveholder who was fearless of consequences, and they preferred a master of this bold and daring kind, even with the risk of being shot down for impudence. Following this logic of aristocratic refinement, one can understand how Douglass found in Lincoln the perfect embodiment of the ennobled father figure. In reality, Lincoln's response to Black people ranged from repulsion to exotic fascination. He enjoyed minstrel culture and had minstrel troops come to the White House to entertain him, and was also known to attend shows when he visited Chicago. Most whites presumed that white blood gave the Negro higher intelligence, beauty, and more evolved sensibilities. The very high cultural standards that Douglass used to distinguish himself from the base Negro are the same standards that make him attractive to and ultimately dispensable to the president. By calling attention to their kinship bond, Douglas reveals how deeply intertwined the issues of relatedness between Black men and white men are with the subject of nation formation for him. Excuse me, let me reread that. By calling attention to their kinship bond, Douglas reveals how deeply intertwined issues of relatedness between Black and white men with the subject of nation formation are for him. Lincoln fails as the father mother figure to live up to Douglas's natal and maternal expectations. And he confirms in Douglas the first permanence of his orphaned, homeless social status. As maternal caretaker and sustainer of the central tenets of the Republic, Douglas expects that Lincoln will give rebirth to the slave, not just freeing him in word from slavery, but birthing him into a social and political body that cancels out the social death of slavery. By the time Douglas makes the speech before the Freedmen's Monument and begins years later to work on the life and times, he had seen Reconstruction efforts go drastically awry. The Freedmen's Savings Bank fiasco, the stealing of land promised to freed persons, and the erection of Jim Crow laws served as indicators of how the nation seemed intent on keeping the slave buried, freed from the coffin of slavery, but socially dead in other respects. To this very day, many of us are still socially dead. Black people overall are socially dead. That's why they don't have any problem shooting us down in the streets because they see us as dead already. And if by chance you are the special Negro in your friend group, right? And it doesn't have to be all white people. It could be them Indians, Mexicans, Hispanics, it could be any of them mixed together. But if you are the special magical Negro in your group, get out of your group and find a new group because they are just setting you up to murder you. Driven by the need for a collective rebirth of himself and the masses of Black people, Douglas would ultimately locate this regenerative capacity in himself. Mother hunger, the sense of being orphaned from the nation, and the desire for intimate belonging, and his own personal legacy of sexual violation would fuel and define Douglas's attempts at self and national rebirth. Beginning to realize an interconnection between the rebirth of the nation and personal rebirth, Douglas broke from white abolitionists because white abolitionists, right, are not so much interested in your Black issue, but they are interested very much in nation building and nationalist issues. They are interested very much in the issues of white people. So they were trying to get jobs for white people, and Black people were standing in the way, and they thought Black people could be used as a useful tool. But Frederick Douglass saw through that, and he broke away from white abolitionists. Okay. In opposition to predominant abolitionist views, Douglas became convinced that there was no necessity for dissolving the union between Northern and Southern states. He felt that the vote has power and that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is, in its letter and spirit, an anti slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence was the supreme law of the land. Breaking from abolitionists and Feeling more freed from his slave past did not mean that Douglass did not have to contend with white male desires, with white male appetites within a culture of consumption. If anything, Douglass understood better how the plantation was as a little nation of its own, and how the nation operated in many respects like a plantation. Douglass came to a much fuller understanding of the plantation as an incestuous household and nation, and the larger republic as a social grave and promise of stillbirth. As I argued earlier in this chapter, throughout history, Black men have typically imagined this dynamic of birth and domesticity in their writings in oppressive female terms. Douglass does this in all of his autobiographies through depictions of Black women raped, especially his mother and his aunts. But what I want to draw your attention to is how this potentially fecund space was also depicted in his fiction and nonfiction writings as a male womb type space, a regenerative space with capacity to give birth to self, nation, and a transformed citizenry. The idea was that if Douglass and Black men like himself could give birth to the nation, then they could, on terms of their own, finally exist. It was a homosocial maternity that Douglass conceived that still largely excluded women and Black female maternity on practical feminist levels. Still, this gesture toward embodying his hunger for liberty and social acknowledgement points us to entirely new ways of thinking about racial legacy and Black masculinity in the 19th century. So, going back to this idea of the Black male womb, he's talking about consciousness being transferred from person to person because, again, we know Black men do not have a womb. And any reference to the Black male womb is reference to, in actuality, the consciousness transfer from one Black man to another. But you need a woman to transfer that information to, especially if you're working through the primary years of a child, because women are the first teachers. So you can never exclude women. And no, I am not a feminist. I am an Africana womanist, where I believe the family is the central unit and that Black men and Black women need to link up arm in arm and fight this fight. We do not stand on opposite sides of this fight. We stand arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, in lockstep, protecting our children and our family. But anyway, The Heroic Slave, Douglass's only published fictional work, teems with references to Black male fecundity. Published in 1852, this text in title and storyline continues what would be Douglass's lifelong project of elevating and glorifying the heroic Black male figure. The hero of the story, Madison Washington, is a composite figure based partly on the leader of the revolt aboard the slave ship Creole and President George Washington. The story opens with the narrator having the reader peer into the dark, a dark pregnant with liberty and the legacy of Patrick Henry, who led all the armies of the American colonies throughout the Great War for Freedom and Independence. We are told that someone is enveloped in darkness and then taken into the searching dark, only to return from the pursuit like a wearied and disheartened mother after a tedious and unsuccessful search for a lost child. This maternal darkness takes on human form in a few pages into the story when, from the darkness, Washington, steps with arms like polished iron, a face black but comely, a brow dark and as glossy as the raven's wing. At the beginning of the story, it is Washington who prays in the darkness, who draws into his speaking John Listwell, a northern white man who feels compelled to stop, descend from his horse, and listen. Listwell, whom we might think of also as listens well, we learn, had long desired to sound the mysterious depths of and thoughts and feelings of a slave. As his eye catches hold of Madison in the shadows, he trembles with terror and excitement. Washington's prayer titillates Listwell, who received his remonstrations as a type of erotic climax. He did not have to wait long. There came another gush from the same full fountain, now bitter and now sweet. Afterward, Washington takes on a glow to his countenance and teems with the hope of freedom that seems to sweeten the bitter cup of slavery. The fact that Washington ruminates on his wife, Susan, in the darkness and experiences anguish at the thought of having to leave her to escape north further highlights the clandestine erotic sharing that Listwell experiences. He experiences Washington, and through Washington, the passion the enslaved man feels for his wife. This copulating in the mysterious impregnated darks results in a rebirth for Listwell. Washington leaves the pine forest and begins his trek north to freedom, but his white interloper is forever changed. From this hour, I am an abolitionist, he swears to himself. I have seen enough and heard enough, and shall go to my home in Ohio resolved to atone for my past indifference to this ill starred race by making such exertions as I shall be able to do for the speedy emancipation of every slave in the land. For all of this, for all of its representational problems, which I will attend to shortly, this scenario is a striking break from the historical tradition of representing the Black female body as the dark, chaotic interior of Black experience. It is a unique moment through which we can imagine and begin to think about a politics of Black male interiority and hunger. Moving beyond images of white males ravishing his body in the past and controlling the terms of erotic engagement, Douglas scripts a homoerotic interchange that is mutually beneficial. According to P. Gabriel Foreman, at the time that Douglas pens his story, he is acutely aware that white men are the only reader citizens imbued with legal standing as witnesses. They are his only politically embodied readers, the only ones, that is, with the vote. So, as a way of harnessing this political power, Douglas attempts to seduce white male readers. Seduction is the means to constructing a new genealogy of African nativity, a new genealogy of American nativity based on the copulation of Black and white male. The character of Douglas combines several strands of American radicalism in one person. He is a reference to the Black plantation insurrectionists and the founding revolutionary fathers of America, specifically George Washington and Patrick Henry. Before the House of Burgesses in 1775, Henry stated in his Libertier death speech, Three millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country that which we possess are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. So, with 3 million people, which is not a large number, that are well armed and adequately trained, you can take over, you can stop the takeover of your community, right? This mandate for national security and fortitude remained unfulfilled in Douglas's mind with the continuance of slavery. Referencing the Henry speech in the Life and Times, he writes, "It was a great thing to achieve American independence when we numbered 3 millions, but it was a greater thing to save this country from dismemberment when it numbered 30 millions." Douglas imagines the heroic male slave as the receptacle of the unrealized national vision Henry espoused. So what you have to remember is that Henry was a nationalist. Patrick Henry was a nationalist. He was about getting the nation open, and they wanted America to be a white nation, and they wanted the white people to live here in comfort and power and have control over everything, right? Douglas unites in his womb the opposite and contradictory forces of white paternity and black maternal legacy. Henry and Washington represent something of Douglas's own whiteness, his lifelong problematic relationship to white male paternal figures, taking their seminal visions into himself, while problematic, as is for Douglas the only choice if he is to make peace and come home to America plagued by white male immorality. Choosing to be a receptacle acknowledges as well the political reality of Black people effeminized and eroticized by whites. Douglas's choice does not ameliorate the stigma and challenges of assuming a feminine posture. Rather, it serves as an example of one Black man crafting agency and negotiating complex, fluid notions of gender at the same time that he experiences himself as circumscribed by these ideas. There is a passage in My Bondage and My Freedom where Douglas refers to his mother as resembling an Egyptian pharaoh. He writes, "There is in Pritchard's Natural History of Man the head of a figure on page 157. The features of which so resemble those of my mother that I often recur to it with something of the feelings which I suppose others experience when looking upon pictures of the departed ones." Some have questioned why Douglas chose to represent his mother with the same image of his male pharaoh. This was an important question, considering that in the same volume there are images of Hindu women and Northern and Southern African types that should have been more appropriate and accurate examples of Douglas's mother. If we think, though, of the image as a meshing of Douglas's maternal legacy and the reformation of the U.S. empire when it makes sense, Douglas recasts his mother as an ancestral figure and bridge to an ancient African royal lineage. By depicting his mother as Ramses II, not only does he ennoble her, but he also enables, by virtue of his bloodline, his natural claim to fame to the American legacy. This image of a male mother presented in the second and third installments of his autobiography reinforces how emotional natal needs confounded prevailing nationalist gender politics. Douglas's consistent move to externalize his natal hunger is instructive. It seems like implicitly he understood that in order to not be consumed by feelings of loss and the sense of emotional and spiritual dislocation that threatened him without fear, he would have to actualize his emotional needs, his hungers. In the image of the male mother and his depictions of the fecund heroic male, we are shown how hunger facilitates a deeper grounding in geography and place that enables him to locate himself in history and in the context of national reformation. The heroic figure embodies Douglas's idea of the Constitution as an essentially anti-slavery document. He conveys his ideas of suffrage for Black men through this heroic male who is male and female, a combination of women's suffrages, politics, and male slave abandonment strivings, and male slave abolitionist strivings, excuse me. His hunger is male and female, and perhaps better understood as a cauldron of self and experience that syncretize the two. Hunger is power, or at least the means to accessing power encased within the discourse of nation. David Leverance has noted that Douglas's entrepreneurial notion of manhood meant not freedom so much as dominance and fear of humiliation. As I have argued throughout this chapter, there is no humiliation deeper or more speakable than the sexual humiliation suffered by one man at the hands of another. Black men found the feminizing outcomes of such abuse untenable as they translated neither into the preferred dominance over nor access to the entrepreneurial benefits of American capitalism. So, what he's saying here is that he found it unreasonable to be seen as a woman, and he tried to break into different fields where he could demonstrate his masculinity. Yet the idea of Douglas as fecund and the image of the male mother suggests that things were not quite so simple. The image of a male mother is a syncretic figure that adds up ultimately to more than the sum of its parts. For example, while the male mother is a new emblem of the nation, it is also a deeply personal metaphor for Douglas, who himself and herself give birth to this symbol of the new. The male mother is a coded representation of the ways that male-male relations for Douglas took form from a fluid sense of gender and the consistent goal of whites to make the male slave into an effeminate relational object. From the framework of the male mother, we see that Douglas was aware of and acted from a place of gender interdependency, indeterminacy, or fluidity. If we acknowledge this complex facet of his self-awareness and representational politics, then we must also acknowledge the broader understanding of who Douglas was and what it means and what he means to us in the present. In the 60s and 70s, historians and activists sought to recover Douglas from the dark 19th century past as the tradition's very own representative man. And this is why every Black school that you see has a picture of Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, but doesn't have pictures of Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey, because he was the perfect effeminized male to be an example of, And even without knowing it, just showing that picture as aspirational to your young children, you are asking them to take on that spirit and that energy, that effeminate way of being, right? That effeminate way of being, just in the fact that those are the pictures that your school chose to display to them each and every day. At the end of the 20th century, cultural critics and feminist scholars such as McDowell, Charles Clifton, and Foreman began to unpack Douglas's heroic masculinity and suggested a more complicated genealogy or genealogies of Douglas's masculinity and personal legacy. I am advocating that our newer scholarship on Douglas integrate and apply the complex vision we now have of of his person and contribution. We should see him simultaneously as a heroic male, a male daughter, a fecund, a birth giving male, a male child who was raped, a striving and self serving patriarch, and an ennobled father of Black letters and liberation. If I had to choose a more central motivated fueling these multiple overlapping and intersecting identities, I would choose hunger over and beyond reason. Falling back upon the female genealogy of hunger and consumption events in Douglas's maternal relations and in his own embodied feminine sensibilities, hunger, as I am thinking of it, is logical, reasoning, and strategic. It is also embodied, sensate, and intuitive. Hunger is a mediating alchemical ground, a point from which Douglas consistently translated which was felt and desired into reasoned action, rhetorical performance, and civic belonging, as problematic as it always was. It is out of Douglas's hunger and in response to forces that threatened to consume him that he dreamed, envisioned, and embodied a nation as complex, unresolved, and a revisionary as himself. Greetings to Realm in the Bush. Thank you so much for tuning in, Cassidra. As the forecast highlighted, uh, Frederick Douglass believed in the talented 10th before we had a title for the talented 10th. He believed that if white people were exposed to the best of Black people, the Black nobility, as the author puts it, that they would see us as human and that they would accept some Black people. But remember, at no point does exposure to whiteness and continued uh, subjecting yourself and your children to them, at no point will they see us as human or humanely. They will always see us as an object of their desire, an object to be consumed, an object to be bred out, to be integrated into, an object to be chewed up and spit out. So I want you to think, when you have these moments of clarity, when you have these opportunities to actually interact and engage with these different people, at no point do they see us as their equal. And if we are only experiencing an aspect of them because we have never been exposed to the fullness of who they are, they've always hidden who they are, then how can we say whether or not they are human either? How can we compare our humanity, our compassion, our love of one another to what they have for each other. I want you to think on that. I want you to think, to remember that proximity to whiteness does not equal acceptance, that integration is death. Miscegenation is just another miscegenation is just another way of them breeding you out, because they will come and take your resources and sacrifice a few generations of their people to get the resources that you have. Do you understand? So if you're wealthy and black, or if you have some resources, a life insurance policy, a good job, something that you can pass down to the next generation of black people for the lifting and uplift and movement of our people to move us forward, they'll put a white girl on you and she will inherit everything, and she will take those resources back to the white community. As Cassandra says, I wouldn't even call them people. She wouldn't even call them people because they don't have the same level and capacity to care and compassion that we have. They don't rationalize things the same way that we do. They are always looking for a way to otherize us and to make themselves something that they are not. They're looking for a way to deify themselves when we are the ones that are divine, when we are the ones that are the children of creation. They are a mistake. Anyway, guys, I want to thank Realm in the Bush, The Forecast, KW Don 7, Anthony McPhail, Sister Raw, and the elders, and everyone else that tuned in tonight. I value you and appreciate you for being here. I recognize that this is running a little bit later, but I want to dice it up into the exact chapters. And so thank you for hanging with me. I know Bawana Haguziki is listening, and G2 is listening, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening, and so many others. I value each and every one of you. If you leave me a comment, I will make sure that I give you a shout out. So make sure that you leave a comment. Sister Ross says the Caucasoids are really the aliens. And Realm in the Bush says, I think they think and act like their diabolical fathers. Absolutely. Absolutely. They think and act and have the intention of their diabolical father. And in her context, his objective was to steal, kill, and destroy. Right? Steal, kill, destroy. That was the purpose. So we have to get to the point where we are standing sure-footed in what we know, and we are dealing with them accordingly. We are not allowing our children to be educated by them. We are not putting our children in situations where they are surrounded, where we or our children are surrounded by them. We are not looking at them as the model or the example of any type of humanity, beauty, sustenance, economy, religion, or anything. They are not the standard. The Black woman is the standard. And I sit here as a Black woman with gray and silver and black twists in my hair talking to you about what it should look like. So just remember, they are not the standard. We are the standard. All right, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. I will be back on Tuesday within the 9 o'clock hour, probably closer to 10 o'clock like I was today, between 9:30 and 9:45 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you on Tuesday. Peace, guys.